Alright, thanks everybody for coming over, or coming down, or coming up, or wherever you went. Looks like we mostly have library people here today. You know me, so I won't bother introducing myself. I think anyone here, is this me, Meneely? You can't tell me? Okay. Anyway, today we have his first gallery lecture series, and Richard Graham from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln has come to talk to us about his work with the government comics collection at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. You can see images on the plasma screen from that collection, and then Richard's book is in one of the cases. And Richard is an associate professor and media services librarian at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. If you have a chance to talk with him about Nebraska and Kansas, we have lots of similarities. It's an interesting conversation. I got caught up at lunch, and it's a lot of fun. But he serves as the liaison for the communications and art departments. He's the managing editor for the online peer-reviewed journal dedicated to comics in the classroom, SANE, S-A-N-E. In 2012, he was nominated for both the Harvey and Eisner Awards for his publication, Government Issue, Comics for the People, which we have here in the exhibition. It's a collection of comic books produced by U.S. federal and state government agencies. In 2017, he co-authored a brief history of comic book movies for Palgrave Pivot, and is currently researching the life and work of Rose O'Neill, creator of the Cupid doll in comics. One of my favorites. Thank you very much. So please help me welcome Richard Graham.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real honor to be here because I used to come and visit Lawrence quite a bit during my undergraduate days when I was in Lincoln studying English. Just a little bit, and there was a great introduction, and I always wish my mother was around to hear these sort of things, what I grew up to be. I don't necessarily look like it, but I am a librarian, so I wore my cardigan. Hopefully that's the uniform of instant recognition. I used to write reviews for a website called No Flying, No Tights, which is a resource for public librarians, for collection development, for comic books and graphic novels. I not only was nominated for the Eisner Award, but I also got to serve as a judge in 2014, and that was a huge honor. And that is my email address. If any of you have any questions or comments or concerns, I suppose, please feel free to reach out to me. Now, before I get into this whole gamut of government documents and comic books, I just wanted to really quickly touch on a connection that our two cities have between Lincoln and Lawrence. If any of you are familiar with the underground comics movement of the 1960s and Robert Crumb's Zap Comics, that was funded by a beatnik out of Wichita named George Plumell. And if you're familiar with the Allen Ginsberg poem, Wichita's Vortex Sutra, it talks about when Ginsberg left Lincoln to come to Wichita. And he wasn't the only one. A guy named S. Clay Wilson, who graduated from Lincoln High School and was a UNL grad, couldn't get out of Lincoln fast enough, and he came here to Lawrence, where he got his start as a comic artist and cartoonist. And he met Plumell, and Plumell introduced him to Robert Crumb, and Zap Comics started, and the whole underground comics movement took off. And a big part of that was a Lawrence Kansan and a Lincolnite named S. Clay Wilson. And Grist was a publication put out in Wichita, and that Wilson illustrated. And I think your art department maybe just got a big donation of letters from someone in the community. So I'm sure you probably have people around town who knew Wilson or had a connection with him. But when William Burroughs was here, the literati of Lincoln would come down and hang out with Burroughs. So we have a strong connection, us two. So I'm glad to be here, and like my hero, Wilson, it's a good feeling to be in Lawrence. It's a real shining city. Many of the comics that are in the book that was published by Abrams are available online, as was said earlier. This was started off as an online collection of taking government documents out of our musty stacks, and I don't know how you store them here, but our government documents stacks was kind of a scary place to be. And so they were really grateful when I was actually pulling materials out and digitizing them and making them available online. So I just found out, however, that the server is down, but we have it through our image, Luna. So if you Google Luna and government comics, you'll get that collection. The Comics UNL website looks like it went down, unfortunately. I tried to make it as easy as possible for people to come and see. So, government documents. When I was a librarian at library school at Iowa, I was a little bit hesitant to take that class. The SUDOC number was a little bit overwhelming. Who needs this sort of esoteric information? But September 11th actually cast an interesting light on government information. That was when suddenly we became, as a federal agency, very interested in the fact that we had documents like how to poison a well and how to use anthrax, right? All this information that was online suddenly became censored and pulled offline. And I thought, oh wow, like, there's a lot of power in some of these government documents. It's not just a remote facility in your library. And when I went digging in there, especially when I became a faculty member at UNL, because there's a research expectation, like here, Nebraska, the librarians have faculty status, and so 30% of my time is supposed to be spent publishing. And I wondered what was an area that I could sort of get into, because I was arbitrarily assigned to the liaison area of computer science, even though that wasn't my background. So I knew that that wasn't necessarily an area that I was going to start publishing in. But I still had a strong affinity for government documents, and I had a sort of an interesting history with it. My father served in the Army, and I'm an Army brat, and one of the first things that he gave me to sort of quell my little, being an annoying little kid when I was visiting him at the motor pool, was to hand me an Army manual that looked exactly like that. And it was a comic book, right? Which was okay, but it didn't have superheroes in it, and it didn't look like any of the Franco-Belgian stuff I had been exposed to in Germany, Asterix and Obelix. None of that, but as a white heterosexual male, I was very interested in the blonde lady all of a sudden, and the anthropomorphic Jeep held my attention, and I'm not kidding, like, within 20 minutes I could probably list about 5 of that, off that list there, 5 items off of that little list. And so as a faculty member, when I went back to Nebraska and I headed into those government document stacks, I actually found that document. I actually found the Gamma Goat manual, and it all came back to me. And comic book studies is an emerging academic discipline. It's multidisciplinary, and let's face it, how many theses and dissertations can we write about Silas Marner, right? So please don't beat me up at the bicycle racks if you're a George Eliot fan, but my point is that in this new era, in a visual culture, comic books had, and still do, have a resurgent interest by academics. And so this seemed to kind of hit all the, check all the boxes for me. So I went diving into our government document stacks to see what we had in terms of comic books. And of course, many of us just sort of associate comics with goofballs, criminals, or children, but not many of us are really necessarily familiar or sort of envision this idea of uniformed military personnel distributing comic books. And what we see here are U.S. personnel handing out landmine awareness comics in Croatia and Serbia, because it's a war-torn country. Excuse me, they had landmines to deal with. Well, when you have children looking for places to, and fields to play in, what's a quick way to get a message out? Well, the United Nations, coupled with the United States Army, came up with comic books in terms of Superman and Wonder Woman warning you to stay out of that area. So there's an interesting history of our government using comics as not only as an educational medium, but also as a propaganda media. And it also mirrors our North American culture's association with comics in terms of having an infatuation with early newspaper strips until finally it being fully exploited and delved into as its own media. So when I went looking, some of the early comics that I found dated pre-World War I or right at the onset of World War I. And what they did is they took popular comic strips that already ran in newspapers and they repackaged it and sold it as a way to contribute to the Liberty Loans at the time. And again, what's interesting that we see here a lot of anti-German sentiment, right? Of course, it's like, how do you mobilize people and how do we make them aware of who the enemy is? And when we study World War I propaganda posters, we see a simplistic or an emotionally charged image that's often coupled with an easily repeated slogan, right? So it's just easy to get into the brain. easy to repeat and chant back out at rallies. And so it's the same thing with newspaper strips here, in that basically inflammatory images with sing-along songs, right? But also we see a lot of some of the heavy hitters that we associate with the history of illustration in terms of James Montgomery Flagg, right? And the whole Uncle Sam, people who worked for Puck and brought politics into the living room for many people. And of course we see a lot of participating newspapers as well that latched onto providing the government with some materials that they could repurpose and repackage for government loans. So here we see even the Omaha World Herald was on here, and some of their editorial cartoonists. I see the Sioux City Journal. I don't know if I see anything. Cedar Rapids. Looks like Kansas escaped the first culling here. But Frederick Burr Opper, who had a very popular strip with the Katzenjammer Kids, which were based off of those Germanic childhood stories. Are any of you fans of the television show The Office? And you know Dwight Schrute, right? Very true. So the two Katzenjammer Kids are based off of Max and Moritz by Wilhelm Busch, and found its way into American newspaper strips. And again, not immune from anti-German sentiment, and then getting folded into a government document. Here we see Ding Darling. Are you familiar with J. Ding Darling? He was one of the first cartoonists, or actually he was the first cartoonist to win the Pulitzer Prize. He was from Des Moines, Iowa, and if you ever vacation in Florida, there's a natural preserve that's named after Ding Darling. All right. So, comics in the United States historically made their appearance along with newspaper strips. Joe Pulitzer had this lofty idea of wanting to elevate the masses with his New York World by having fine art printed in the back of his newspapers, but that didn't do very well. So when he hired Richard Outcault to put out Hogan's Alley, and then eventually became the Yellow Kid, from which we get, right, yellow journalism, when William Randolph Hearst purchased him away, it created a huge bidding war. And what happens is that these comic strips were geared for adults of various literacy rates. And if you can imagine, in a world of black and white, that last page, right, and newspapers were very big, they filled the eye. That last page became very popular, and it sold newspapers across the United States. And so if you were blessed in that you could write and draw a story, you were probably going to get a job with a newspaper in your area putting out a comic strip. And so the United States government kind of took notice out of how that popularity and how to harness it through three major studies. Are we all familiar with the Gallup poll? And George Gallup, and one of the very first polls that they did out of Iowa was about the popularity of comic strips. And this is when we all became very familiar with the idea that this is what's driving the newspaper industry in North America right now, is this love of the strip. And people's immediate emotional attachment to the various characters that they would encounter. So the Yellow Kid, right, has survived in our vernacular in terms of yellow journalism, but these people were so popular that there would be cross-marketing. Now, when we go to Burger King and we see Iron Man trying to sell us the Whopper, that's nothing new. The Yellow Kid was so popular that they were then selling, rolling papers and flour. And we're familiar with Buster Brown shoes, I hope, right? And it's hard to talk to a younger generation sometimes, but if you can remember Buster Brown shoes, by gum, that's based off the Buster Brown comic strip. Okay, so the Advertising Research Foundation, and then later on the Office of Wartime Information, conducted their own studies on the popularity of comic strips in American culture. And what they realized is that these strips not only create a commercial frenzy, but also can shape hearts and minds. Office of Wartime Information, for example, had found out that during the shift in popular culture from when China went from being our enemy to being these poor, oppressed people by Japan, that a lot of the caricatures that people used were actually to our own detriment, not because they dehumanized people, but actually because they caused our soldiers to underestimate the enemy. So when we, in comic strips, start showing Japanese soldiers as slovenly or German soldiers as idiots, we actually started to believe that as a culture. And so they found that when we would be confronted in a battle situation, that actually had come into play. And so the Office of Wartime Information said, well, what we need to do actually is produce a counter-narrative, right? And as I said earlier, for example, we used to view China as the enemy, right? We had the whole Fu Manchu in the 1930s. However, and of course we welcomed Japan because they embraced Western ideals. We had to do a lot to sort of flip that coin. And I'm going to show you one of the ways that we had to do that culturally. But historically speaking, comics were very, very popular from the onset. And politicians latched onto that immediately. Case in point, President Roosevelt. This is an actual official government document. This was not published like we later on did with Hoover, where the Democratic Party or the Republican Party starts using comics as propaganda materials. But in this case, we actually have the US government wanting to tell the life story of President Roosevelt. And this actually created some kerfluffle because many senators thought that this was campaign materials being financed by the American tax dollar, right? And he's not necessarily wrong. When we look at these early comics, we actually see some pretty innovative techniques. We see images that are broken out of panels. We see cinematic wide shots that cause us to then focus in on action shots. I mean, for a comic that was put out in the 1930s, this could be read very successfully with great interest by a modern comic reader. But of course, nothing is done by accident, especially in comics. And so how do they portray a president who sits in a wheelchair, right? They show him riding horses, up and about, right? And of course, this is something that we revisit time and time again because of the power of images and how persuasive they can be and how we can frame it and sort of impart a message on the consumer or reader. Of course, I like how Uncle Sam is towering above the Capitol here. It's just a fascinating comic to read. And again, there is an innovative use of paneling and flow and storytelling. And not to mention the fact that they were even conscious enough to put this out in Spanish. Right? I think this is a very progressive attitude in the United States to put out a government document in dual language at a time when we were very ethnocentric and very e pluribus unum in trying to get everybody to think of us as one national identity. I think it was, like I said, very progressive to recognize the fact that the United States was made up of other non-speakers. But again, it's these powerful images that people use that elicit emotional reactions that also I think historians are also finding very interesting, right? Because most of the time, comics are commercial media. That means they rely on us to purchase it, otherwise, it evaporates. So if no one bought it, right, and then you couldn't get away with that. So when we think about how we portray the other, right, we dehumanize them, right, we rely on caricature, and then we in fact perpetuate it. So, right, this is a pretty racially charged image here that at the time, no one blinked an eye at, in fact, probably, encouraged, right? But we also see how they depicted African-American servicemen at this time, too. And this is this was included in Army Motors magazine in 1941. And in this case, this is an intentional inflammatory image. In this case, this is just standard operating procedure, right? When I'm a comic book artist and I want to tell a story of a scientist, right, there's an economy of text here, right? I can't get into the long history. She got her BA, at Washburn. She got her MA at Cambridge, right? How do I depict someone's a scientist? Caricature, right? Lab coat, maybe a balding guy, right? Maybe with a pocket protector. That's our shorthand for scientist. Even though many of us here know scientists and they look nothing like that, right? It's just a shorthand caricature that we have to do to quickly convey meaning. Well, historians find these sort of images very interesting because do you think that this image would be appropriate today? No, absolutely not, right? I mean, it has an homage to the pickaninny, right? Or to where I grew up in Nebraska, people had lawn ornaments, the lawn jockeys, right, of the African American, with the exaggerated lips. This is not a flattering image at all. But again, this is the power of comics, and it is at times intentionally harnessed by our U.S. government. So one of the things that I want to show you in how they did that was with these pocket guides that they would give to servicemen as they would go to foreign countries, right? So you take a an enlistee or a draftee from Kansas, and you put him in China, they want to give him a little bit of introduction to the local culture or whatnot. And so one of the more famous comic book artists, Milton Caniff, volunteered his services at the height of World War II to the U.S. government and said, hey, I can't serve, but I can draw. And so he volunteered his services. So I don't know if you're familiar with Steve Canyon or any of the other Milt Caniff. He was an Ohio State graduate and actually funded the heck out of that school. But this was included in a U.S. Pocket Guide to China. I'm sure you probably have it here. There are 2 editions, actually, believe it or not, the 49 and the 50. The 49 contains this comic book in the back geared towards GIs. I don't even want to say it, right? But the idea was that you want to introduce a shibboleth to the natives because Japanese people cannot roll their R's, but Chinese can. And so if you're a Gen Xer like me who went to music festivals, well anyways, here's the word Lollapalooza, for example, is introduced here as a recommended shibboleth where we would try to have a native try to say that word, and then you could discern whether or not they were the enemy. Right? And we get into all sorts of uncomfortable areas of, whether you can tell by the shape of their skull whether they're a criminal or not, right? I mean, it starts to make one very uncomfortable. But at the time, right, you had one of the world's most popular comic book artists illustrating a manual for American soldiers. Okay. However, the next year that the U.S. government, the GPO, put out this handbook, they did not include this comic. So I don't know whether they had the foresight and recognized that this is a racist and ineffective document, or whether they could tell that down the road it probably wouldn't look well for them. However, Milt Caniff did work with others like Herb Bloch. I don't know if you're familiar with Herb Bloch, but he was a popular newspaper cartoonist. I coined the term McCarthyism. And this was a document that they put out for psychological warfare, right? In terms of the literature that you would distribute to the enemy to convince them that they were facing a superior foe, right? Does anybody want to guess who maybe the major artist who contributed this document might be? Can anybody recognize that style? Yeah, that's Dr. Seuss. If you're familiar with him, he boarded a train, went to the West Coast. He served under Frank Capra, believe it or not, right? Colonel. Frank Capra was a colonel. And they put out government documents. And this was one warning you about the dangers of malaria, right? And hopefully if Bill Gates has his way, right, this will be an antique. But I'm going to guarantee you that this is also probably going to be in your GovDoc stacks. And in fact, there's your SUDOC number right there. That's a W1 2M85. I don't know if anyone wants to go digging later. You may want,
I think it's been ripped off.
Right?
Oh, really? Did you hear that?
What's that? Did you find it already?
I've looked for it.
Someone's stolen it already?
I think it's been gone for a long time.
So, that's unfortunate because but as you can imagine, there are collectors. I have a little bit of the ADD, so bear with me here. So my current research focuses on Rose O'Neill, the creator of the Cupid doll, another Nebraskan who forsake Nebraska for Missouri, like John Nyhard. She published a lot in ladies' home journals, right? Great works of art. So and of course as a land-grant institution, we've got them bound. No, someone has gone through with a razor blade. It's just really disheartening. But that's part of the reason why I try to make these items available online. Because first of all, it sucks a little bit of the resale value out from underneath, because now it's available free online, and if you have an espresso book machine or a nice printer, you can just print off your own comic book. But I also don't want to encourage it, so I'm really sorry for that. And comic books are an interesting field of study. I think maybe, I feel like I have a brotherhood with maybe a historian who studies Civil War, because there's a lot of citizen scholars, right, who do not necessarily have an academic background in research or whatnot, but they can talk to you all day long about that topic. Even Treasury notes were done. If you're familiar with Al Capp, who was a problematic figure in his own right, but a very talented comic artist, so if we're going to separate the art from the artist here, the Shmoo, decorating U.S. Treasury bonds. And those fetch a pretty penny too these days too. But again, the U.S. capitalizing on this cultural affinity to the comics. Okay? The name's on it, but you could maybe recognize this too, but this is Winter Draws On. This was a government document put out for the United States Air Force, and it was done by Walt Disney. And I just want to talk a little bit about this. Disney was nearing bankruptcy at World War II because the European market was then closed off to him. And one of the ways he found to survive was by firmly planting himself on the government teat, by putting out government information films, pamphlets, you name it. Disney was just cashing that government check left and right. And one of the things that he did that speaks to his business acumen, but in England, the children's author Roald Dahl, right, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, he was drafted and worked for the Royal Air Force, the RAF. He came up with a story for the RAF for one of their little government documents about the gremlins. And the idea was that when you have to, as an airplane pilot, you have to constantly monitor and be on the lookout for gremlins. And any of you Twilight Zone fans? Because we will come full circle to that too. So Roald Dahl writes a cute children's story for the Royal Air Force, reminding pilots to be diligent and to constantly check your instruments and to make sure you do your pre-service check before you fly. Walt Disney steals that story from Roald Dahl, copyrights it, and sells it back to the U.S. government. And this is at a time when Milt Caniff, Al Capp, all sorts of people who were 4F or could not serve were volunteering their time. We have Walt Disney actually charging the U.S. government. Not only that, from a story he stole from another children's author, right? This is usually when the hatred for Walt Disney sort of bubbles up. If anybody has had to deal with copyright, and I actually had to, pay Walt Disney $500 to reprint these two images in that book, even though this was a work-for-hire contract for the U.S. government over 60 years ago. But Walt Disney was very keen that they get their money for that, for this reproduction. So I'm a little bit uptight about Walt, and we all know maybe about his racism and whatnot, but it is absolutely amazing to me that how Disney was able to immediately glom onto the U.S. government, crank out its literature and information, and then do so in a way where they, at no cost to themselves, practically. So one of the strongest people that is associated with comic books and U.S. government is this man over here, and his name was Will Eisner. And Will Eisner had a popular comic strip called The Spirit, and he was already financially successful before he was drafted. And he was sent to the Aberdeen Proving Grounds, which is ironically where my father later on, my dad drove a tank, and so a lot of, it kind of mimics some of Eisner's journey. But Eisner was drafted, and they said, whoa, we got ourselves a comic book artist here, fellas. And they immediately put his talents to use. Okay? They didn't, I know we're all cynical about the government buying, $100 hammers and $200 toilet lids, but they were actually smart, and they're like, this gentleman has a talent. And so they put him in Army Motors, and so this is one of his early government illustrations in 1945. And during that time, he realized how important his comics could be. And I had a long talk with my old man about this too, about why would the Army use comics? And it makes sense, because when you have a draft, you have people of various literacy rates, right? You're going to have somebody with a 6th grade education from Louisiana trying to talk to somebody who went to OCS, right? And it's all the same information. And it is absolutely imperative that they get this information because it can literally save your life, right? And so Eisner noticed not only how soldiers reacted to his character that he created, which was this guy named Joe Dope, an everyman, a U.S. Army man, don't be like Joe Dope, a negative example of how to bumble your way through with the world's best equipment. But he also, as an educated man, realized that there was a methodology and a science behind this too, and how we process images in a step-by-step process for concrete examples. And so his time to shine came during the Vietnam War. Now, after Army Motors and during the 50s, Eisner started a monthly magazine called PS Monthly, and that actually runs to today. And it's for preventative maintenance, and it was for people in the motor pool, and it was like that manual I showed you in the very beginning, on how to keep your car running, how to keep the trucks running, your lead acid batteries. And this is actually an Eisner poster. So if you walked into if you're at a local military post or an army post, you would see posters like these around, and Eisner drew those as well. But he knew that people would follow them in a step-by-step process. And I think younger people can understand, right? The TLDR generation, too long didn't read, right? You see a 5-paragraph Reddit post, and you just look for the footnote, right? The TLDR at the bottom. And we can't help our attention span, even if we're in a theater of war, okay? And again, the idea was they like to assume that we were all mostly white heterosexual males, so they like the idea of putting blonde women in a lot of these centerfolds. But they absolutely got your attention. Now, the M16 was a very problematic weapon when it was first introduced, especially in the Vietnam theater because of the humidity, the climate. And it was a new gun that was causing a lot of jams. And so Eisner put out an M16 manual in a waterproof bag, in a comic book. And it absolutely was proven to save lives immediately. And you can tell, right, the step-by-step process here. Right? And Virginia Commonwealth University actually digitized and has all PS monthlies available online. And so you can go to their website and look at them all. And they're pocket-sized. They fit right into so you can carry it. They don't look like your typical superhero comic. And they all have great covers, fascinating. And they even start to incorporate elements of popular culture. And here is that M16 rifle comic. So, because Will Eisner was a great, people had a lot of respect for Eisner. Because it's a U.S. government publication, I don't know if you know this, but the government can't be sued. You can't sue the government for copyright infringement. So, and people like Joe Kubert, who later on came in life, they took on the contract for PS Monthly. So you start to see people like Spider-Man making appearances in Army manuals, and if you read comics or DC comics, you would know this is Sergeant Rock meeting Sergeant Half-Track here. And so I'd imagine a lot of readers got a hoot out of that. But you know who else likes to sue people besides Walt Disney? Is not J.K. Rowling herself, but it's her company who owns the Harry Potter rights. So I don't know if you're all familiar with copyright and trademark, but fair use allows satire and parody, and let alone if you're a U.S. government entity. But PS Monthly incorporated a spoof of Harry Potter, and we see Dumbledore here, and I think we even see Professor Snape there on the bottom left, right? And we see polyjuice potions, and we even see some likenesses, right? That looks like Hermione Granger to me, and Ron Weasley. That looks like a good Snape to me, right? Well, J.K. Rowling tried to sue them, and that did not go anywhere, because they got to remind Miss Rowling and her company of satire and parody, but also the fact that the U.S. government can do what they will. All right, and this is actually a kind of a funny story of the flying car. If you're a Harry Potter fan, right? And so we see the flying car here too. So Eisner was not just an army guy. When he got out of the military, he realized the comics are an absolutely viable education medium and can be used for nonprofits, but also sold right back to the United States government. So the Health and Human Services Division used him, especially during the Johnson era, when we were interested in inner city youth and getting them job training, was to have Eisner put out these comic books for him. And so some of them are rather cringy, because, I'll talk about this later too, but have you ever had that one high school teacher that wanted to show how hip and cool they were with the kids, and they used an outdated, right? So basically a lot of that goes on. These are very cringy in that they're trying to be hip, and they're trying to get the youth hip to the get a job, man, but mostly it's just pretty failure. And in fact, it probably caused a lot of people to go, yeesh. And that's actually why a lot of these comics are kind of worth a lot of money. Because if you think about it, you give it to a bunch of fifth graders, well, this doesn't have Spider-Man in it, right? Throw it away, right? I'm not going to read this. Well, That meant only 5 survived. And those 5, Will Eisner, right? Oh my gosh, give me that comic, give it $200. And also for state governments too, right? And so this is Nebraska Game Commission posters that Eisner did on gun safety. These were done everywhere, so the states got to put their little stamp here. But I know if you go on eBay, if you were to go through maybe a former game warden's trailer, you may find some of these rolled up there with Kansas Game Commission, stamped on the bottom of it. Right? But again, the idea is that Eisner intuitively knew that we were visually drawn and that you could harness those images for whatever purpose, right? Because think about it, right? The Confederate flag, for example, right? I mean, you just show the stars and bars and all kinds of emotions get riled up immediately, right? So people, especially comic artists, use that specifically to get you engaged as a consumer or reader. So these are a couple of Army recruitment documents that were put out. They were published by the GPO, but they were sent to newspapers and they were included as little foldouts. And these are comics that basically try to convince young white males to join the Army for various reasons. Okay, and you know how I talked about how they used outdated. So this is a comic book that came out in the 1950s. And in this comic, they're trying to tell you, it's a story of a guy who showed up at a college campus and he just couldn't fit in, all right, until he found Pershing's Rifles, which is an ROTC group. And one of the benefits, of course, of joining the service while you're in college is that chicks love you, man, right? And so what's funny is that, again, this comic came out in the 1950s. And so she's like, oh, I was just thinking about the song, There's Something About a Soldier. Well, I looked that up. That song was popular in 1938. Right? I mean, again, it's just that you can't help but stagger over yourself and that you're desperately trying to prove how relevant you are and how hip and cool you are. But because of the long process that it takes and the vetting, especially for government information to undergo, that by the time you crank something out, you're going to have almost an opposite effect. Like I said, at this point, people reject the comic. They don't say, oh, yeah, right, I want to be popular. They're like, oh, my gosh, it's so out of touch. No way, right? And again, we can also consider these tools of hegemony, too. I mean, this is absolutely about reinforcing power structures and ensuring the status quo. I mean, these comics were absolutely geared towards white, middle-class men and reinforcing ideas that dulce decorum est, right, is good and glorious to die and fight for your country. But also coupled with job skills, right? Now you'll have a job skill, so when you graduate. But also, time to get the women cranking out the boys too, right? So somehow joining the Army is going to ensure that you'll only, someone brushes up against you and they're going to be pregnant with your next son, right? And so again, it can be cringy, but again, if you're interested in, like I said, tools of hegemony, these comics can almost take on a certain sinister meaning, right? So if you're familiar with the history of comics or if you love Batman, an 18-year-old Neil Adams did a comic book for the Army National Guard. And this was around the point after the 1960s when the U.S. government started to start subcontracting some of their comics. So the GPO stopped putting things out and we started subcontracting with a couple of companies. This one was called Johnstone and Cushing, located in New York. It was an advertising agency that specialized pretty much in using comics as an educational tool. Did any of you grow up on a farm and use Caterpillar materials? So Caterpillar used to put out their farm machinery as a comic book manual produced by Johnstone and Cushing. But again, the idea here is that, first of all, most comic book nerds are pretty much blown away that Neil Adams, who's famous for highlighting the trauma of Batman, and there's a famous Green Lantern story that he did with Danny O'Neill, where Green Lantern encounters an African American who says, "I've seen you save yellow people and green people, but why aren't you helping black people?" Neil Adams, we're working for the U.S. government here, putting out a National Guard a comic about flying over Korea, and it's a very thrilling story. And like I said, it uses very innovative techniques. And it'd be absolutely one that people would have held on to. One of the things I noticed, you have a document on here about Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And a lot of these comics tend to reflect different presidential preferences. So when Johnson was president, we had a lot of anti-drug comic books, okay? And when Clinton became president, and if you're familiar with the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, that was when the public became sort of involved with the integration of homosexuals serving in the military. And this was actually done during the Bush administration, but George Bush did not want this published, but Clinton said okay. And this is a document, this is an actual comic book about serving as a gay person. And it is so cringy because, again, nothing is done by accident. All right? When we think about Marvel Comics or DC Comics as commercial entities, you've got the penciler, you've got the editor, you've got the inker, the colorist, and the whole time somebody's saying yes, no, that. You can imagine what goes through with government information, right? In terms of the diligence that people do to make sure that we're not offending or we're not giving away secrets. So I had spoken with a pastor from Virginia who served on the committee to crank this material out. And he had said that that committee got together because of the increasing suicide rates among enlistees, tied to Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And these were clergymen who were signposts who saw this and wanted to put out a document to address that, and they thought Don't Ask, Don't Tell might be the answer. And this story, though, has been whitewashed so many times that he said that it was very frustrating because they tried desperately to be inclusive, to represent not just gay men, but gay women, bisexuals, and even transgender issues. And of course, with Chelsea Manning now, right? I mean, these are issues that the service actually has to deal with. And the artwork in this was atrocious because they saved money, right? You got to save money. So when you have a low budget, you can't hire the best artists. Well, comics are a show, don't tell medium. Okay? Again, there's a visual literacy that is incorporated when you want to successfully read a comic. And when we think about this Neil Adams, right, which is trying to show action and tension and using cinematic shots to make you feel more involved as a reader, and now you see something, a serious issue like homosexuality, and we have flat colors, we have two-dimension objects. I mean, it was treated kind of almost disrespectfully. And you could tell that this is not something they put a lot of effort into. And subsequently, this is a document that came and went and had very little impact. But it's one that I think is important to drag out because it's not visually appealing. The stories are not very interesting either. But again, it's an important document because it's a role in how our government dealt with homosexuality in our armed services. Now, we all know about graphic novels, right? We go to Barnes & Noble today, and we see that there's a whole section that's dedicated towards it. And U.S. government is no different, okay? They've sort of swung back the other way. And this is a government document put out by the Navy, and it's about Marine Corpsmen who served in Iraq and the PTSD that they encounter as first responders, as medics. And it's a thick graphic novel. I mean, like the term. And it's comprised of various stories, first-person stories of actual service members recounting their tales of what it was like to serve. And comics in the military, especially, have a long tradition. Like I said, I'm an Army brat. My dad was in the Army. He was a recruiter, and I don't remember seeing any of these, but occasionally you'll find them out in the wild. And these are Navy recruiting comics, and you can see it right here, but I think that's a South Dakota recruiting station. No, it's from New Hampshire, at the post office in Keene, New Hampshire. So again, right, various literacy rates. How do you make something seem more exciting, right? Because believe me, in these comics, right, we, especially the one that's geared towards the women here, Judy Joins the Waves, right? There's no mention of the possibility you may die for your country, right? It's always, women will love you, you'll get those job skills, it's really good for you to serve the country, right? Your dad probably did it, you're probably not a real man if you don't serve the government, right? But of course, the most realistic thing was like, I might just get my head blown off. So this is, I'm fortunate enough to own a couple of pieces of original art to this, though I didn't bring it. But again, sometimes the government had the foresight to not just be, towards white men. They actually recognized that the United States is a diverse country, right? They wanted to bring women into the fold, so they actually made comics that were dedicated towards recruiting women into the Waves, which is an auxiliary service. Sorry. I just have to, just kind of like, why? But that's why. Manga, right? Very popular with the kids these days. So, of course, the U.S. Navy cranking out their own manga. Because, not so much of a chance that you don't necessarily have to be someone who can carry an M16 through a jungle. Nowadays, you probably have to be more proficient in IT, nuclear radiation, stealth technology, maybe how to navigate, right? So the Navy puts out a manga. And it's all about serving on the USS George Washington. And I cannot read Japanese, so I do not know, but I'd imagine that there's some sort of soap opera going on here, right? That's how it goes. And in fact, we even put out a joint white paper with the Japanese government, right? So manga has a strong tradition in history in Japan, and they have no problem cranking out government documents left and right in comic format. And so sometimes we actually join them. So here, I don't know if you can see it well, but this is a combination of photo image with drawn over cartoons. So, oh, that's not me, is it? No, okay. It's like, did I put a train whistle gif on this or something? So, because comic books were a political football in the 1950s. I think we were all probably very familiar with the 1950s Inquisition when Frederick Wortham cranked out Seduction of the Innocent, and he had done his research and had noticed that amongst juvenile delinquents, the one thing they had in common were funny books, right? Mm-hmm. So that was a good time to be a politician because that was the political football that you could kick around. So not only, right, was the government at the time cranking out their own comics, right? As Whitman said, do I contradict myself, right? Very well then, I am massive, I contain multitudes, right? Well, if there's anybody that's massive and contain multitudes to contradict itself, I'd say the federal government fits that bill. Because on one hand, they're cranking out, they're having they're having meetings and hearings, and your local politician, from the mayor all the way out to your state legislature, right, are worried about the kids, right? And of course, that's an argument that's been with us till today, right? What about the children? So not only are they cranking out comics, but they're also cranking out their own studies, and not only on a federal level, but on a state level too. So here we have a committee to investigate crime and interstate commerce, but we also have Colorado state governments involved, holding their own hearings. So I don't know, maybe Kansas, if you have some Kansas state documents, I wouldn't be surprised if you see, that they actually held a hearing, in Wichita on the very topic. Right? So while they're putting these out, warning us about, we're losing the space race because, here in the United States, youth culture is burgeoning. We're going to drive-in movies. We're reading these weird science fiction stories, right? And meanwhile, the Russians are in outer space, right? Well, the government is also putting out Al Cap, How to Survive Natural Disaster comics at the same time. So again, the contradiction is dizzying, but right, if anybody's massive enough to not know what the right hand is doing, I'd say the federal government is definitely it. So while they're saying it's a horrible communication medium, they're actually trying to get people to learn how to save their own lives. And we have people like Ed Dodd and, like I said, Al Cap. So we had some very famous people working on these comics, while at the same time they're being disparaged, right? But this is probably one of the more familiar government images that has to do with comics. Do we all know Duck and Cover? Right? And the idea that when an H-bomb hits, you just simply have to crawl under your desk and everything's going to be okay. Right? And I think The Simpsons did a good a job making fun of that. So this was a famous film reel that maybe some of you maybe even saw in your own classrooms. I remember the beep, right, and then whoever got to volunteer, right, got to turn it, right. But it was also a comic book, and so Bert the Turtle saving us from ourselves. State governments getting in on the action, right? Again, youth culture. How can we reach the kids these days? I think the kids are reading comic books. Well, there's too many kids in Virginia, I guess, riding their bikes on the highway. I don't know, right, with the needs assessment that was maybe done here, but somebody convinced the state government of Virginia to put out a very interesting comic book about the devil. That's right, the devil, Satan himself, luring our youth and getting them. There he is, right there. That's Satan. That is a government. That is a state government document by Virginia. Could you imagine that today? I mean, I'd imagine that we'd be hung up on committee, like, how are we going to represent the devil? Well, which devil, right? I mean, oh my gosh. I mean, there's so many, right. But these were simpler times, I suppose. But again, the idea here is, we look at them now with some sort of kitsch or like a revulsion or some sort of oddball fascination. But the artwork is very competent. Again, I just don't understand the need of somewhere in Virginia. They must have had a hard time with a lot of kids riding bikes on the interstate that they put out a comic to try to get to them. So there's all kinds of states that we can attack. Universities too. So this is Columbia University in conjunction with the state of New York, telling you not to smoke drugs because if you do, you will drop out of Columbia. I think that's what Allen Ginsberg did, right? So maybe that's actually what happened. But this is probably one of the more things that we tend to associate government information with, right? Is McGruff, the crime dog. And again, the message that gets muddled because in an attempt to appear relevant, right, they try so far that it becomes hyperbole, right? And we can outright reject it. So again, this is the sort of stuff that came out during the Johnson administration. And this was also put out in Spanish, Jucadio. It's chunky. And there's its SUDOC number there, FS 2.22. And again, the idea was that, look, you smoke a joint and you're going to do heroin tomorrow. All right? And in this story here, this is a story of a guy who's down on his luck. And he smoked a joint and decided that wasn't going to cut anymore, so he starts doing heroin. And I don't know if you're familiar with how relationships work. Right. But often your partner will be very curious about what is so appealing, and so then they'll want to join you, on your demise there. And so that's exactly what happened here. I don't understand. You're robbing stores. You're stealing your mom's TV. Well, maybe I should try it too. I should see what this is all about. Right? Why would So again, someone thought this was a good idea. Obviously, kids did not agree. There's some other funny unintended consequences. Teenage booby trap was also rehashed and given to the military for soldiers when they served in Vietnam. This reads like a catalog of, maybe I'll try this, or maybe I'll try that. And in fact, it's almost a how-to go to your dealer and almost order, like, what I want. It's giving you, so codeine was known as schoolboy, so now I know and it's telling me what to expect. I mean, it's almost reading like a catalog of, maybe I want to try this experience, or maybe I'll try that experience. And they all have, these crazy images, right, that are just, again, hyperbole, take it or leave it. But and again, perpetuating some of the entrenched racism, right? Cannabis, marijuana, right, having to do with an anti-Hispanic immigration sentiment. All of it feeding into now being repackaged as an anti-hippie sentiment. But like I said, the education it imparted wasn't necessarily what was intended, right? So we have VD comics too. If you want to know what the word is that Johnny got, that word was syphilis. A comic book, right? And I'd imagine like a doctor, a 1960s doctor, I don't know, the decorum wasn't so they could talk to you, but here's a comic book, Johnny, right? And of course, athletic, top of the class, but he got a touch of the sex, and now, he's an unproductive member of society, and he absolutely needs to be spurred. And so this is where we start to kind of go down a path of groaners and sort of misattempts and misfirings by the government. Again, At this point, they still recognize that the comic book is a very powerful communication medium, and they strongly associate it with youth culture. But the way they pull it off at times is cringy. So here we have an elephant, the preventing poisoning elephant. It just doesn't roll off the tongue too easily. You know, I don't know if they had just imagined kids like with Superman, like I'm Pip, right? But the idea, of course, is that they most notably associate superheroes with comics, and of course that's to not, you know, you can't necessarily fault them for that. But if, like I said, if you have any inclination with independent publishing, or if you even go to a bookstore, you will see memoir, right, is almost told in graphic fiction or graphic novel format. And superheroes, while they're driving Hollywood, are actually, you know, kind of whittling down. Comic book shops are actually kind of in trouble. And there's a whole kerfuffle about having women and persons of colors or whatnot. But again, the idea here is that the government associates now superheroes with kids. And so anytime they want to get something to the kids, they're going to try to Captain Enviro, right? Captain Elephant. But they also had a lot of successes, and some that still resonate today. So I think we all know Smokey Bear, and it's Smokey Bear. It's not Smokey the Bear. So if you want to be that person at a party, you can now. But Smokey Bear started as a comic book in 1950, and there's Rudy Wendeline who did the art. Just beautiful. And of course, the American Ad Council took over the trademark. And in fact, this is one of the first hiccups in copyright with government publications. If you don't know this, anything put out by the GPO is in public domain. Okay? Smokey Bear, public domain. Except, very commercially popular. So now you have companies putting out Smokey Bear merchandise. And in fact, now you have companies putting out Smokey Bear ashtrays, Smokey Bear lighters right now. So now it's actually going against the dang message. So the government had to reel it in and pump the brakes. Now there's an exemption. Smokey Bear is out of the public domain, and so is Woodsy Owl, by the way. So those are two copyrighted and trademark characters. And in fact, there's a government document about Woodsy Owl costumes and Smokey Bear costumes, proper handling. If your Smokey Bear costume is in disrepair, you have to burn it. It cannot go to other people, because you cannot have, you know, Joe's Crab Shack or John's TV sales getting it out of the Goodwill or out of your dumpster, right, and using Smokey Bear to sell the commercial product, right? So it kind of makes sense, but on the other hand, you're like, whoa, right? You're supposed to burn the American flag if it's beyond disrepair. Might as well throw this broken Smokey costume on top too, right? But this image, I mean, again, Smokey Bear, very popular to the point now, right, where we're having wildfire problems. They call it Smokey Bear syndrome, because we're having so few wildfires, right, that the underbrush has now developed to the point where when a fire does happen, it gets out of control really quick, because we've done too good a job of keeping natural wildfires out. So, famous people come back into the fold, and they lend the U.S. government their characters. This is a really cute story. I'm not even going to pronounce what the what the affliction is, but it's basically it's the technical term for lazy eye. And this is actually a very cute comic because it encouraged students to wear their eye patches, and it actually mirrors something they've discovered in commercial comics. When the superhero Hawkeye had a hearing disability, in the 1970s, they put out issues where he extolled having to use his hearing aids. Suddenly, hearing disabled kids had a superhero, right, that they could identify with. And what happened? An increased use in hearing aids. So it's the same thing here. When we see popular characters, and also parents too, right? I mean, parent buy-in. Parents also read the comics. Parents recognize Charlie Brown. Parents were more likely to read this with their kids and also reinforce the message, right? But again, there's a lot of times for grown-ups too. I don't know if you're familiar with Rex Morgan. This is a comic book that talks about fetal alcohol syndrome. And I mean, I know it's a good time to beat up on white guys, but seriously, if there's a comic book definition of mansplaining, Rex Morgan does all of that throughout this comic book. He's constantly mansplaining to the pregnant women what's going on, right? And this lady's at her shower, and she has a glass of wine, and she slipped and cut her arm. She had to go to the emergency room. Well, did you know that she's a real horrible mother? You know, because she could have given her kid fetal alcohol syndrome. I mean, Rex gives her the riot act. I don't know if you can see on this last panel though. They're all smoking cigarettes because they hadn't discovered low birth weight yet. They haven't associated that, right? So it was like, whatever you do not have a glass of wine while you're pregnant because you're a horrible mother. But, you know, puff demurely, you know, away because that's good for your nerves. Right? Classics, right? But also some interesting pieces of art that we see here. Golden Age artist Joe Meneely, who did a lot of Western comics and actually was on the rise at Marvel. I think he actually died on a train outside of Manhattan, Kansas. He fell off a train and died. But Joe Meneely contributed some art to this because when Social Security became prevalent, you had to educate the masses. Again, multi-literacy rates, combination of word and image, and if you have a compelling image, and this was a golden age for comic artists, so people like Joe Meneely, and then here we have Ed Dodd, who did Mark Trail. And Mark Trail, really popular, they named a part of the Appalachian Trail off of him. So contributing. Even the underground comics movement got involved. A hero of mine, Dennis Kitchen, who did Kitchen Sink Press out of Wisconsin, and actually became a friend of Will Eisner's. And when Will Eisner became interested in comics in the 1960s and 70s and ran into Dennis, one of the first comics that Will Eisner saw was an S. Clay Wilson comic to bring it all together. But this is, Dennis was, like I said, an underground comics artist, sex, drugs, rock and roll, hippie, putting out a government document for his home state of Wisconsin, warning people about consumer fraud. This is another interesting story put out by Malcolm Ader's Commercial Comics Company. Malcolm Ader was an interesting character, and we were fortunate enough to work with the University of West Virginia right now, and they're sending me all of his papers and the original art and all the scripts and the letters he received. He used to put out comics for people like George Wallace and a lot of Southern politicians for their propaganda, so I'm very eager to look into that. But he also worked for the U.S. government as a subcontractor, and this is a comic book that he put out for the CIA that was airdropped over Grenada during the invasion. And Malcolm Ader had to meet his contact outside the Washington Monument, where the guy gave him a briefcase with $30,000 in cash, and he gave him the printer's proof, and the CIA published this. And like I said, they distributed it. And one of the things I'm going to be getting soon in Lincoln is the letter from the Cuban embassy about this comic, so I'm super excited to see it. But interesting things. First of all, there is no voice. There is no victims of international communist emissaries. Okay, this is all a front, right? Ronald Reagan is portrayed in this comic literally with a halo. All right. I mean, again, when we talk about as a savior, right? To trust the United States, right? Again, telling one story. And these are some of the comics that we saw then earlier too. So they're not necessarily psychological operations. They're not necessarily all bad. They're not necessarily perpetuating hegemony or the status quo. But here again, we see the example of commercial interests working with government entities and nonprofits trying to save lives. So in that very beginning, when we saw that image of those soldiers distributing comics, these are those comics that they are giving out. And again, this is from U.S. presence in another country, noticing a problem, wanting to address it, and actually, I think, doing it in a successful manner. And so these comics were put out, the United Nations, ultimately UNICEF published it. You can see the UNICEF up there. So I don't know their UN call numbers, but they've got that cranked out. And they put it in Croatian and Serbian to help cut down on landmine deaths. And the United Nations, of course, also is in the comics business. Right, there's more than one culture, right? There's manga in Japan, there's bande dessinée, Franco-Belgian, the photo novella. And so the United Nations has actually done an interesting job putting out comics. This is one of their more recent ones about combating desertification. It's not about, that's not about getting desert, but deserts, right, are cropping up, and how countries are trying to combat it. Okay? And so the EU put out a little something. So this would be absolutely appropriate for Brexit because this is when it was the ECC, the European Commission. And again, the idea of, we have long histories of warring with each other, but it's probably in our best interest to work as one, as one entity. And this is a government document put out by, I believe, from Ghana, from the government printing office of Ghana, which is telling the story of one of their leaders. So that's that. That is the long history of government comic books. And I encourage you, if you have any questions or if you want to talk to me about it, feel free. Again, this is my email address. Oh, I'm going to have to get out of here so you can, if you don't want to talk to me in person, I can understand that too. But there's my email address if you have any questions. I brought some things to maybe show you that I thought you might be interested in. We were talking about comics, but we're delving a little bit with the world of popular culture. So are any of you board game aficionados, right? So we know Settlers of Catan is a big deal, right? And Dungeons and Dragons has never been popular. Well, the U.S. government, actually the Army, put out a board game in 1966 for Leonard Wood. I know we're not supposed to talk about Missouri around here, but for Leonard Wood in Missouri, they put out this combat engineer game, and it was the first board game to use hexadecimals on their maps. And that's what Dungeons and Dragons borrowed. So believe it or not, right, you can come up here and take a look. But yeah, we actually are in the National Guard actually put out a board game too that's a combination of the Magic the Gathering card stuff because of the collectability, right? Well, they want to show, because the Army has a video game out, so the National Guard also has another board game. But this came out, like I said, in the 1960s. It was for combat engineers. You could be the Soviets or you could be the United States. And you basically, took turns role-playing. I brought a citizen booklet that was given out by the U.S. government. It was subcontracted by Harvey. Harvey put out Casper the Ghost and Hot Stuff and Wanda the Witch and Little Dot. And so this is a collection of civic-minded comics. So once you're out of the Army and you were an officer, they gave you this, and it's basically, I'll maybe just pass it around. It encourages you to run for office. Of course it's always dudes, right? This is an actual photograph of a soldier reading a government comic book, right? Some neat posters. I don't know if some people really like the comic strips. So if there's any Chester Gould fans, or if you're a Dick Tracy fan, but there's the GPO number right there. So maybe it's in your flat file, somewhere. But encouraging people to participate. But I don't know if you know this, but zip codes were a BFD. All right, Social Security was moving heaven and earth, getting everyone to sign up for the Social Security card. Well, getting everybody to understand their zip code was also arduous. So they invented a comic character named Zippy the Zip Code, and right? But so they also said, hey, maybe we can already use some of the more popular comic strip characters. So people like Carrie Drake and whatnot, encouraging you to use your zip code. Right? Well, I wish we could have those problems, right? Again, if you'd like, you can maybe come up here. I'd shown this Eisner poster. I appreciate it because of its, its attempt at diversity. Right? Recognizing, as my dad said, right, we're all green in the Army. And then what I have here is a piece of original comic art that's in that citizen booklet. It was done by a guy named Al Avison. Al Avison was a Golden Age a comic book artist, and he did work on some superhero titles. And I like to bring this because, first of all, some people don't necessarily see original comic art that often, and how it used to be on a bigger scale, and then how they had to shrink it down. But you also see a lot of the corrections and the editing that takes place here too, in terms of dimensions and notes and what to change. And of course, if you're an artist, you might like to see the whiteout, right? They didn't just draw it all in one shot, man. Right? They had to do it again and again and again before they finally set it to ink. So in a way, yeah. So so our tax dollars subcontracted this original piece of art. So it's my pleasure to share it with you. So does anybody have any questions? Yes, sir.
You talked in your presentation about government comics that were used to sort of go against drug use.
Yeah.
Did Frederick Wortham's efforts or the Comics Code Authority have any effect on the U.S. government's comics abilities to publish certain content? Or
Oh, that's a good question. So, if you're not familiar with what he's referring to, after the seduction of the innocent era, where we were worried about how comics were turning the kids out, in order to avoid government regulation, the industry wanted to regulate itself. And so they came up with something called the Comics Code Authority. And it's a little seal that they would put on the cover so you would know. So as a parent, you could say, oh, I can buy this for Johnny because it's not going to have overt acts of violence in it or misogyny or sex or any of that other stuff. And because of that, there was a long list of things that you could not write. And that's why we have Mad Magazine, for example. Ed Gaines had done a famous short story that he reprinted of an astronaut meeting people from another world, and it turns out that astronaut was African American. That was the big reveal. And they were like, you can't do that. You cannot have an African American hero. All right. I mean, that was overt racism, and that's when Gaines was like, I'm done. I'm now putting out a magazine. It is now Mad Magazine, and I'm not putting out anymore. Okay, so that was a hand-tying, handicapping movement by the industry, because now you could no longer have romance stories, right? And you could no longer have. So the only thing to survive was superhero genre, basically. And Wortham even attacked that, right? He just famously had said that Batman and Robin had an inappropriate relationship. But again, the good guys always had to win. Bad guys could never win. You could never show any crime like that. So absolutely. But that got challenged in the 1960s because during the Johnson administration, right, the rampant drug use that became is that when they decided it was a health crisis. And so that's when Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams did the Green Lantern with Speedy having a heroin addiction to show that. And so that rocked the boat, and that went against, but it still met the Comics Code Authority. I know Marvel put out a Spider-Man story that did not have it, but they still were commercially successful. So that's when they decided to rewrite the Comics Code Authority to be able to include real life. But again, you could not portray it positively, whatever that means. Because, I mean, what is Doctor Strange but one big ass? I mean, literally Ken Kesey and, painted Doctor Strange on his bus, for the electric acid test. But the government has a habit of disregarding everything around itself. Like I said, at this time, when people are kicking the football around, they're putting these out at the same time. The very same printing press in Washington, D.C. that's cranking out, this hearing over here on the far left is cranking out these two comics too. So, no, it did not affect them because they could disregard it.
Okay, thank you.
What a long way to say that. I'm so sorry. Are there any other questions if I promise to be more succinct? Yes?
I guess I was kind of confused by when you were talking about the manga and how it looked like it was in Japanese, but it was printed by the U.S. government.
In conjunction with. And in that term, because what that means is that they gave them the money and that we would distribute it partially on our end. So if you can imagine, high schoolers in San Diego probably got it handed to them. All right? Sailors already serving and Marines already serving probably got it handed to them for free there too. So it's a recruitment tool, but it was done primarily through the Japanese government as a government document for Japan. Because they put a lot of their stuff in manga. Because Japan is a commuter culture. I mean, everyone is constantly commuting. And so manga is a big deal for them because it's easy, quick to read while you're hanging on your subway strap or things like that. So adults read it, so there was never a cultural purge. So there's no stigma if you're a 55-year-old man, reading a manga. No one's looking at you funny. Like, well, I don't know if they look at you funny nowadays, but it used to be, right? Again, we mostly here in North America associated comics with kids or criminals. So the Japanese manga was a recruitment tool for United States kids here, but mostly a Japanese document. Yeah.
Do you think that comics, like in paper books are as popular today as they once were, and so that comic book artists would be as well known in this kind of publication and have the same kind of impact as they once did. I mean,
That's a tough road to hoe because if you were to accept a government subcontract, you probably need the money, right? But on the other hand, a lot of times they don't allow you to sign your name on these materials anymore, right? Because that's a distraction. The idea is that you're just supposed to impart the government information. And artists, I mean, that's their bread and butter. You have to brand yourself. I mean, you write your signature on the bottom. So that might start to feed into whether or not that'll serve you in terms of your popularity. I do know that Joe Kubert's family, I think, is still doing the PS contract. So in that way, they may be perpetuating that brand. But I don't know. It's such a mixed bag because the Army does a lot of subcontracting now. And so they'll probably just find an ad agency to handle that aspect for them. But sometimes you'll occasionally see, like I have a comic from Norman, Oklahoma that was put out in the 80s because there was a service member who could draw, right? And he put out a little comic for him. So, and then if he's, unknown or whatever, but maybe he could have gone on to then got a job tomorrow or something like that. So it's hard to say whether it's in their interest or not, or whether or not that'll actually happen. I do know, however, that as a librarian speaking, right, our print circulation is kind of down, but our comic books and graphic novels section is still very popular. It still resonates with people in print culture. It's the same thing with comics as a commercial and educational or informational medium. People still consume them. Whether people like to look at stuff on their phones and online and stuff like that now, but these are still popular things to print and hand out if you're a nonprofit or an educational institution, or if you're thinking about communicating a specific message as a government agent.
anybody else? Questions? Okay, well, Richard, thank you.
Yeah, thank you all very much.
This was really fascinating. It's a wonderful addition to the exhibition. We've all been kind of, I say we all, some of us certainly have had our heads in government documents for a long time, and this is just
well, now anytime you see a comic, you put it aside and maybe let me know, and I may need to digitize for you. Yeah, no, I'm dead serious. Let me know. Yeah.
Well,
Just
thanks so
pulled one out
much.
today.
Oh, really?
Yeah, one of my students said, I was telling them about them,
Uh-huh.
and they were like, well, why? And I said, because of different levels of people reading, and a lot of people being drafted were young men.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
and the centerfolds and stuff, and they were like, oh, and he pulled one out and showed me, because we're doing some beautification,
Uh-huh.
and he's like, look, what you were talking about.
Yeah,
Just today.
fabulous.
Just,
Again, there's just a whole history of people like Mort Walker. There's anti-bootlegging comics. There's one called Don't Be a Sugar Daddy for bootleggers, because I guess in the 30s, people were selling sugar so you could ferment to brew your own alcohol. So the government put out a comic book on that. So there's a rich history there. And like I said, it's filled with knowns and it's filled with unknowns. It's filled with groaners, but it's also filled with some interesting works of art. And so I think it's something else that maybe it's a new lens to look at your government documents with. So I absolutely encourage it. And sometimes it's even fun to see if you can maybe find one. Right? If you go through the A's, through the agriculture, right, you might find that Smokey Bear comic. And definitely...
there's a lot in the D's.
Yeah, right? And there's some great Smokey Bear posters. I mean, there's some beautiful, beautiful art that Rudy Wendeline did for the Department of Forestry. So, yeah, let me know. I'm eager to grow the collection.
All right, so thanks very much.
Thank
guys,
you.
There's,
Yeah,